This is Ball's Pyramid. It is 1,843 feet tall. It's 50% taller than the Empire State Building, and it juts out of the Pacific Ocean. It looks like a supervillain's lair.
There's a jagged blade of rock rising out of the Pacific that's taller than the Eiffel Tower, and it doesn't want visitors. Sailors feared it. Climbers heard voices on its ledges. Scientists found something on it that shouldn't even exist. Ball's Pyramid is more than just a stone spike. It's a living mystery. And when you hear what they discovered hidden inside its cracks, you'll understand why some call it cursed. The Lure of the Stone Knife. December 1965. 2 years after their first failed attempt, Bryden Allen was back. He stared up at Ball's Pyramid, the tallest volcanic sea stack on Earth. 1,800 feet of crumbling basalt rose straight from the Pacific, so thin it looked two-dimensional from a distance.
This is Ball's Pyramid, and it juts out of the Pacific Ocean.
The rock sat 643 kilometers from Sydney in water over 2,000 meters deep. No beaches, no safe harbor, just vertical cliffs hammered by South Pacific swells. Even experienced captains wouldn't bring boats closer than 50 meters. One rogue wave, and you were smashed against the rock face. Allen knew all this. He had come anyway. In 1963, Allen, one of Australia's premier rock climbers, had formed a team of 4 to tackle the pyramid. Jack Pettigrew, John Davis, and Dave Witham had joined him. But as that expedition drew near, circumstances allowed only Allen and Witham to proceed. Despite their enthusiasm, the duo faced insurmountable difficulties that prevented them from even landing on the pyramid. Undeterred, they had directed their efforts to a nearby climb on Mount Lidgebird, successfully establishing a new route. The group left with the determination to regroup and make another attempt. Now, that second chance had arrived. On the deck, Allen gripped the railing and studied the impossible climb ahead. Behind him, his team stood silent. Their earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by the memory of their previous defeat. The water around the rock was a churning chaos, waves exploding against the cliff face in a perpetual, thunderous roar. The boat's captain came to stand with them, muttering about the rock's reputation and a history of bad luck. A sudden gust of wind whipped around the spire with a high, piercing shriek that was more than just weather. None of them knew that somewhere high on those cliffs, in cracks barely wide enough for a hand, something was alive. Something that had been hiding for 80 years. Something that would change how the world saw this rock forever. But first, they had to survive the climb.
And your hand's wet. Hands are wet. Shoot, damn it.
This time, failure was not an option. A foundation of fear. The feeling of dread hanging over the 1965 team wasn't new. It was an old story, a legacy of fear passed down through the logs of ships and the tales of sailors. Long before their boat ever chugged into its shadow, the pyramid had been building its reputation.
This island portion of New South Wales in Australia with its dark black and grey coloration is clearly volcanic in origin.
It started in 1788 when a British naval officer named Henry Lidgebird Ball first recorded the spire. He saw it, gave it his name, and wisely kept going. His logbook entry was a simple mark on a map, but it was the first official acknowledgement of a place that seemed to warn people away. The message was clear in the sheer cliffs and the waves that exploded against them. This is not a place for men. Nearly a century later, in 1882, a geologist named Henry Wilkinson decided to test that warning. He and a small crew managed the impossible. They landed on a tiny, barnacle-crusted ledge. They were the first men to ever set foot on Ball's Pyramid, but their triumph lasted only 2 hours. The weather turned with a vicious speed that felt personal. The sea, which had allowed them to land, suddenly wanted them gone. They scrambled back into their dinghy, fighting for their lives against waves that seemed to target them, escaping with little more than a handful of rock samples and a healthy new fear. The pyramid had tolerated visitors, but only for a moment. That same feeling of rejection haunted the next serious attempt, the one that should have been on the minds of Bryden Allen and his team as they stared up at the rock. It happened just 1 year earlier, in 1964. A team led by a determined adventurer named Dick Smith had arrived with the same goal. They were skilled and brave. They made it onto the rock and even began to climb. But from the start, things felt off. It wasn't just the normal dangers of climbing. Small, inexplicable things began to happen. Pitons, the metal spikes hammered into the rock for safety, would pop out of cracks that seemed solid. Ropes would snag on nothing. It was as if the mountain itself was subtly undoing their work. Then came the incident everyone tried to forget, but no one could. One of the climbers, an experienced and level-headed man, was resting on a wide, seemingly secure ledge. Without warning, a wave of pure animal panic overwhelmed him. He began to hyperventilate, frozen to the spot, convinced the ledge was tilting to throw him off. It took his teammates a long time to talk him down, to get him moving again. He said later it felt like the rock had gotten inside his head. That wasn't the only story. Others spoke of a persistent, itchy feeling between their shoulder blades, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. They would glance over at the dark, narrow fissures that scarred the cliff face, seeing nothing but blackness, but feeling the weight of attention from within. Dick Smith's team retreated, defeated. Publicly, they blamed the terrible weather and the crumbling rock. But privately, they shared stories that sounded less like a mountaineering report and more like a ghost story. They called it bad luck, a cursed climb. Back on the boat in 1965, Bryden Allen and his team knew these stories. They had read the reports and heard the whispers. They told themselves that the 1964 team just wasn't prepared enough, that their equipment wasn't right, that their nerves had broken. They dismissed the talk of panic and watching shadows as the products of exhausted minds. They were different. They were better prepared, more determined. They would not be spooked by sailors' tales and the excuses of a failed expedition. But as their boat rocked in the violent swell, the stories didn't seem so silly anymore. The dread they felt wasn't just their own. It was the accumulated fear of everyone who had ever been challenged by this stone. They were not the first to feel it, and they were walking in, knowing they had ignored every warning the pyramid had ever offered. The first steps. The team plunged into the churning, shark-infested water, swimming for the nearest rock ledge. Bringing their boat closer was suicidal. Struggling under the crippling weight of their gear, they finally hauled themselves onto the stone, exhausted and chilled to the bone. On land, they carved a temporary camp from the boulders and began probing the pyramid's base for a weakness. After testing several treacherous lines on the slippery rock, they found a route leading upwards to a flatter shelf about 100 meters above the sea. This ledge was a godsend, offering storm shelter and, crucially, a cave that perfectly housed their radio equipment. Nearby, sheltered rock pools formed a surprising haven, a place to briefly marvel at the vibrant marine life in the pyramid's shadowed waters. This rocky ledge became the springboard for the main ascent. On the first day, the team pushed upwards, reaching the summit of Winkelstein Steeple, the farthest point achieved by the previous expedition. It was a sobering milestone, a reminder of the pyramid's defiance and the long climb still looming above them. To make the route safer for the attempts ahead, they began the brutal work of installing fixed lines of cheap hemp rope at each pitch. It was a grueling, muscle-straining task, hauling the heavy coils up the sharp, unforgiving face. Yet, with every laborious pull, they gained a few more meters of secured passage, threading a fragile line of safety up the monolith. Their progress was proof of stubborn perseverance, but the rock was already taking its toll. Every piece of gear felt heavier, every gust of wind sharper. The initial thrill of the start was gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the climb. They had proven they could establish a foothold on this hostile island, but the true test, the vertical world above the steeple, was still an unknown, a silent challenge waiting in the clouds. They were no longer just climbers on an adventure. They were intruders in a place that seemed to actively resent their presence, and the real battle for the summit was just beginning. Breath from the deep. The first hours of the climb were a brutal physical fight. The rock was a treacherous enemy, not just loose, but treacherous in a way that cheated the senses. A handhold might feel solid under a climber's weight for a breath, then collapse into dust and knives of shale.
Colin shows me one of the largest swath map images taken on Surveyor of the entire region, and it is extraordinary.
It became less like climbing and more like convincing the mountain not to throw them off. They tested cracks, found one reliable, committed to it, and the whole section would shift with a sickening grind, as if the pyramid were rearranging itself to spite them. Physical danger soon doubled with something stranger, a low, deep hum beneath the wind and the ocean's crash. It was felt more than heard, a vibration in the teeth and bones coming from inside the stone. Sometimes that hum snapped into a crystalline crack, like a giant glass sheet breaking in some hidden chamber. No one had an explanation. Then their bodies started to betray them. Out of the wind, the temperature would drop without warning, a breath of pure cold that vanished as quickly as it arrived. A climber would pause, blink, and for a moment forget where he was or what he was doing. Seized by sudden disorientation, the air carried a strange odor, sharp ozone, as after lightning, braided with the heavy bite of salt. Jack Pettigrew, the team's usual optimist, fell silent. He stopped joking. He became robotic, moving through the climb with a hollow steadiness. During breaks, he would sit apart, staring into the ocean with a distant look, as if the abyss were whispering something only he could hear. By the second day, the mood had slid from tense focus to a steady dread. High on the blade of stone, the world below had narrowed to a dizzying silver sheet. They found a narrow, sloping ledge, just wide enough to huddle on for the night. While securing ropes, John Davis noticed a dark fissure at the back of the ledge that led down into absolute black. The oddity wasn't the darkness, but the wind, a constant, ice-cold stream pouring from the crack. It was not the erratic gusts outside, but a steady, pressurized exhalation from the belly of the mountain. They held their hands over it and felt the unnatural chill. This was no natural draft. It was a breath. Later that day, Bryden Allen led a pitch and froze. From his stance, he saw, for one breath, a human-shaped silhouette on an empty ledge 50 feet below, a shadow with no face, a standing dark. He blinked. It was gone. He told himself exhaustion or a trick of light, but the seed of fear had been planted. The mountain wasn't merely trying to kill them anymore, it was watching them. Every breath felt monitored, every movement answered by the stone's silent, patient attention. A Valentine's Day conquest. At 2:30 p.m. on St. Valentine's Day, after a grueling 8-hour battle with the final crumbling 1,000 feet, Bryden Allen hauled himself onto the summit of Ball's Pyramid. He stood, breathless, atop the world's tallest volcanic stacked spear of basalt jutting from the vast Pacific. Minutes later, John Davis and Jack Pettigrew joined him on the tiny 30-yard-wide platform. There, surrounded by the shimmering expanse of ocean, they celebrated a historic first. The pop of a champagne cork echoed, where only seabird cries had been heard for millennia. The effervescent bubbles, a fleeting tribute to their monumental effort. They built a simple cairn, tucking a written message inside, a testament to human perseverance left on one of the planet's most inaccessible perches. The view was a breathtaking reward. Below, the pyramid's sheer north and south ridges and craggy faces plunged dramatically into the sea. 11 miles away, Lord Howe Island glistened under the sun. The moment was shared, however unwillingly, with a pair of startled gannets, whose nesting ground the climbers had temporarily intruded upon.
One can clearly see the base of what was an almost unimaginably large volcanic mountain sliced off at the base like a knife.
The triumph was only half the journey. As the afternoon faded, they began their descent down the precarious south ridge, leaving fixed ropes behind to aid future climbers on the treacherous terrain. Darkness overtook them, forcing a bivouac in a sparse cave, a humble contrast to the majestic summit they had conquered just hours before. When they departed the following day, February 15th, the climbers left more than just a cairn. They left a legacy, and as their boat pulled away, the Gannets returned noisily to their peak, reclaiming a sanctuary that had, for one brilliant Valentine's Day, been gently touched by history. Obsession and preservation. The first successful ascent of Ball's Pyramid in 1965 did more than conquer a summit. It issued a new challenge. The question was no longer if the spire could be climbed, but how many different ways its formidable faces could be overcome. For a growing community of climbers, the pyramid transformed from a one-time prize into a lifelong obsession, a jagged dare demanding new routes and fresh storylines. It was this obsession that drove climbers like Keith Bell. Known for attempting routes others considered suicidal, Bell partnered with John Worrall in 1970 to tackle the unexplored West Ridge. From the water, the line looked obscenely difficult, a serrated skyline of thin spires and smooth, weathered faces. Where the first ascent had a logical ridge, the West Ridge was a pure, uncharted gamble. Their climb was a brutal confrontation with the mountain's temperament. The rock, a series of crumbling spires known as the Sister Gendarmes, offered unreliable handholds. Progress was agonizingly slow, hampered by loose stone, defensive seabirds, and rain that glazed the basalt into a slick, dangerous surface. They spent nights strapped to ledges barely wider than their bodies, waking to the sound of waves crashing against the rock below. After 2 days of relentless effort, Bell and Worrall finally reached the summit. Their success was a pivotal moment. It rewired the pyramid's mythology. What had been a single heroic act was now a field of possible triumphs. New routes and ridges began to germinate in the imaginations of climbers across Australia and beyond. By the late 1970s, Ball's Pyramid had cemented its reputation as the Southern Hemisphere's most savage test piece. It was a legend whispered about in climbing circles, a remote oceanic fin of rock that demanded absolute commitment. Standing on its summit became a defining dream for a generation of adventurers, a story worth any risk. This growing fame, however, was tempered by a sobering list of hard truths. The basalt was notoriously treacherous, often fracturing without warning. The sea provided no safe harbor, with swells capable of smashing boats against the cliffs. In bad weather, the concept of rescue was a fantasy. Helicopters were vulnerable to the vicious, unpredictable gusts that snaked around the rock. An injury on the upper face could mean a catastrophic situation with no feasible solution. Yet, the ever-present danger did not diminish the pyramid's fascination. It defined it. For those who answered the call, the mountain became the ultimate proving ground where meticulous planning, superior skill, and sheer nerve collided with the unyielding reality of the natural world. Each successful ascent, each narrow escape, and each failed attempt added to a public ledger of feats and mishaps, only drawing more attention to the lonely, irresistible spike rising from the Pacific. The spire was no longer just a rock. It was a legend, built one hard-won, perilous climb at a time. Survival on the spire. The perception of Ball's Pyramid began a fundamental shift in 1986, when authorities in New South Wales instituted a complete ban on recreational climbing. While safety concerns over the unstable basalt and treacherous seas were a primary motivator, the decision marked a turning point in the spire's identity. It was no longer to be seen as a conquerable peak, but as a protected sanctuary. Its forbidding isolation, once a challenge for adventurers, was now recognized as a fragile ecosystem. The ledges and cracks that climbers used as handholds were, in fact, vital nesting sites for seabirds and the last refuge for hardy endemic plants. This ban did not diminish the pyramid's mystery, it deepened it. The rock became a restricted zone, accessible only to researchers with special permits. Yet, the most compelling reason for a scientific visit originated not from official policy, but from an old clue left by the very climbers who had been banned. Decades earlier, in 1965, a team scaling the spire had made a curious observation. They found large, unexplained insect droppings on a remote ledge. The detail was puzzling. What insect of that size could possibly survive there? But it was logged as an oddity and largely forgotten. The clue, however, refused to disappear. It pointed to the potential survival of the Lord Howe Island stick insect, a creature known as the tree lobster, for its massive armored body. The species had been declared extinct after being wiped out by rats on Lord Howe Island in the 1920s.
The Lord Howe Island phasmid became extinct on Lord Howe Island because of the influence of rats recently in 2001.
And for decades was presumed lost forever. The 1965 droppings suggested a sliver of hope. In 2001, a team of scientists and skilled climbers arrived with a specific mission: to follow that decades-old clue. Their expedition was a direct response to the climbers' anecdotal evidence. Scaling the same dangerous faces that had challenged earlier adventurers, they searched the isolated ledges and deep fissures. Approximately 100 meters above the churning sea, they made a discovery that would stun the scientific world. In the soil beneath a single spindly bush, they found a population of about 24 Lord Howe stick insects. They were large, some 15 centimeters long, with glossy, dark bodies, a living species resurrected from the history books. The discovery fundamentally rewrote the story of Ball's Pyramid. The 1965 climbers had not just been conquering a rock, they had been unwitting witnesses to a miracle of survival. Their anecdotal evidence, once a minor footnote, was now the crucial link that guided science to one of the century's most dramatic rediscoveries. The pyramid was confirmed not as a barren rock, but as a lifeboat. The immediate conservation effort was swift. A few insects were carefully collected for a captive breeding program, launching a long-term project aimed at one day returning the species to a rat-free Lord Howe Island. The story of the stick insect became one of second chances.
The Lord Howe Island stick insect was thought to be extinct until a colony was discovered on Ball Pyramid.
But it was also a story of interconnectedness. It showed how the observations of one group, the climbers, could, decades later, provide the key for another group, the scientists, to unlock a profound ecological secret. The ban on climbing, intended to protect the rock, had ultimately helped preserve the conditions for this revelation, transforming a symbol of human adventure into a beacon of conservation hope. Where fear marries wonder. Ball's Pyramid has always been a measure of human ambition against an indifferent natural world. For early sailors, it was a lethal navigational hazard, a blade of basalt rising from the Tasman Sea. For modern climbers, it became the ultimate test, a near-vertical ascent requiring immense technical skill and raw nerve. But in the 21st century, its meaning deepened further, transforming from a climber's trophy into a vital sanctuary for life itself. The mountain's first impression is one of pure intimidation. Its slopes are vertical. Its base is perpetually lashed by swells capable of flipping small boats, and the treacherous winds make helicopter support a lethal gamble. For those who attempt the climb, every move is a calculated risk. The rock itself is untrustworthy. Seemingly solid basalt can crumble without warning. Bivouacking on a narrow ledge is a battle with exposure, and the possibility of rescue is slim to none. It is a place that enforces humility, which is why so few have ever reached its summit. Yet, this forbidding exterior is the very source of its awe. From a distance, the pyramid is an architectural impossibility, a stark, black blade on the horizon. Up close, it reveals itself as a complex cathedral of stone, sculpted by millennia of wind and salt into ridges and spires. At sunset, it becomes an inked silhouette against a fiery sky, a sight that is both fierce and profoundly beautiful. The pyramid's greatest wonder, however, is its stubborn capacity to harbor life. The rediscovery of the Lord Howe stick insect, a large, prehistoric-looking creature surviving on a single, precarious bush, transformed the rock's identity. It was no longer just a geological monument, but a last refuge, a living testament to nature's tenacity in the most unlikely of places. This discovery shifted human perspective from conquest to custodianship. For scientists, it became a natural laboratory. For conservationists, sacred ground.
So in some regard, hanging off the rope in the dark and not being able to see further than your hands was, in fact, a bit of an advantage.
The subsequent captive breeding program offered a rare narrative of hope, the dream of one day returning this lost species to its original home on Lord Howe Island. So, what is the experience for those who finally conquer it? The climbers who have stood on its summit describe a victory stripped of triumph. The peak is not a spacious plateau for celebration, but a precarious fin of rock. The physical exhaustion is immense, but it is the psychological impact that lingers. After days of clinging to the wall, hyper-focused on each handhold, the summit offers a terrifying vastness. The ocean stretches out infinitely below, and the wind howls with a new intensity. There is no room for pride, only a visceral understanding of their own fragility. The descent brings a final, sobering lesson. As they rappel down the same daunting faces, their perspective has shifted. They are no longer just climbers battling a rock. They are visitors in a sanctuary. They notice the fragile rock pools teeming at the waterline and the knowledge that the last of a species clings to a bush somewhere in the shadows. They leave with the understanding that they have not dominated this place, but merely been permitted to pass through. The true lesson of Ball's Pyramid is not that fear and wonder are partners, but that the former is a prerequisite for the latter. The mountain uses danger to command respect, and in doing so, reveals its true treasures only to those who approach with humility. It remains a planetary monument not to human achievement, but to resilience itself, a 562-meter-high reminder that life endures in the most hostile corners of the world, and that some places are meant to be endured, not owned.